What would you say to him if the human race, all of humanity, lived with amnesia and had forgotten their origins and roots, in a society where certain individuals spend enormous amounts of money and energy just to keep people in that amnesia, to keep them in a constant state of ignorance and semi-consciousness, just so they would remain passive consumers who unconsciously serve the system and never ask any questions? Is it really possible that we have forgotten our entire history, a history that is much older than what official science claims? Have you ever wondered how religions even came to be and for what purpose, long before the Bible, the Quran, and all other holy books, people worshipped gods and demigods? Has it ever crossed your mind how people even learned about these gods? Was there someone among our ancestors who, one day out of the blue, wondered who we are, who created us? Who created the world around us, or is it something completely different altogether? Many people among us are searching for answers to new questions today, and among them are some very interesting scientists and researchers who have offered different interpretations of our history. People like the writer and researcher Gretchen, whom I greatly respect, believe that our civilization is just one in a series of civilizations that have risen again from the ashes after cataclysms that struck our planet. All the technology and knowledge we possess are not our inventions, but rather rediscovered ancient technologies of our ancestors. A. Ancient technology and knowledge that were given to them by celestial beings whom they called gods, though he would say that they weren't gods at all. Thank you very much for that. That's absolutely zero. Thank you very much indeed, my trusty sword, for your truly invaluable service. Today, we are heading to the land between two rivers, ancient Mesopotamia, located between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, a place where a highly advanced civilization and a people called the Sumerians suddenly appeared. More than 6,000 years ago, the emergence of such a developed civilization wouldn't have been so strange if there were evidence of a gradual transformation of the then nomadic hunters and gatherers into a settled people capable of creating such a civilization. For literally thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, we wandered the mountains. Through forests and prairies, hunting animals for food, wearing their skins, and gathering plant fruits. During this time, we lived in caves and temporary primitive settlements. Then, suddenly, in historical terms, almost overnight in the area of present-day Mesopotamia, we transformed into a highly advanced civilization that suddenly understood how to build large cities capable of supporting a great number of inhabitants. Many people don't realize that the ancient Sumerians invented the very shape of today's civilization, the modern civilization you live in now. Most of the things you are very familiar with first appeared with the Sumerians, such as laws. Schools, legal relations, business contracts, agriculture, medicine, economics, astronomy, all of these existed in the ancient civilization. The organization you see today was created more than 6,000 years ago, and most importantly, it seemed to appear overnight. One more very important, if not the most important thing for today's story, was writing. The Sumerians created the first script, the script you know today as cuneiform, a writing system over 6,000 years old, written on clay tablets where these kinds of symbols were impressed. They recorded almost all of their daily activities, from laws, yes, even laws, all the way to sales contracts for land or the purchase of livestock. Everything was put in writing. A child was born to us, why not mark that event and record it? Official documents like birth certificates. They had those too. The Sumerians were already doing all of this over 6,000 years ago, and now, when you have a civilization like this, a civilization that created the first and oldest script in the world, I think you should definitely be interested in what this ancient people had to say about our origins, what they said about their own history, what they said about ancient times that happened long before they even existed, what they believed in, and who exactly their gods were. And, at the end of the day, who are we humans? The answers you can find in their records might help some of you understand how organized religion came to be, because the story you are about to hear is 1,000 years older than the Bible, which I've only used here as a small example. And today, we're talking about the Sumerian book of Genesis. Allah. In 1849, British archaeologists discovered 14 clay tablets that spoke about the father of all beginnings, the supreme being and creator who was worshipped as a deity. This being was not worshipped by humans, but by beings whom humans themselves worshipped as gods. The thing is, these beings were not gods at all. The first 2 tablets talk about who these beings were and where they came from, describing the 6 days of creation and the establishment of settlements on earth. The records then talk about the very creation of man, stating that it was these very beings who came to earth that created humans. All the technology and knowledge passed on to humans came from these beings, over 445,000 years ago. The creator gods, as they were called, came to earth. The only living beings on earth at that time were wild animals, plants, and ancient humanoids like Homo erectus. These beings were called the Anunnaki. Their name means those who came to earth. They came from the sky. Their home planet was called Nibiru, a planet that enters our solar system every 3,600 years, moving in a highly elongated ellipse around our sun. Nibiru is described as being several times larger than our planet, full of iron oxides, making the planet completely red. According to Sumerian records, the atmosphere of Nibiru, the home planet of the Anunnaki, began to deteriorate, turning the planet into a hostile place for life. In an attempt to protect the atmosphere and life on their planet, the Anunnaki were searching for a solution. A very rare but important element that had the potential to save their atmosphere was gold. Interestingly, in recent years, scientists have actually considered that gold nanoparticles could be used to purify the atmosphere and protect against radiation. Speaking of which, have you ever wondered why space agencies use gold foil to protect their spacecraft? As for Nibiru itself, it seems that an object of such size really does exist in the outer parts of our solar system. But astronomers don't call this planet Nibiru, they call it Planet 9 or Planet X. I talked about this in more detail in a video of the same name. According to Sumerian records, when the Anunnaki came to Earth, they established a mining base called Eden, which some authors have translated as Earth Station Number 1. At that time, 445,000 years ago, these beings known as the Anunnaki had a lifespan of several 100,000 years, which was later confirmed in the ancient Sumerian king list. The royal expedition that landed in the area of today's Persian Gulf was led by the supreme commander named Enlil. Interestingly, the Anunnaki were not the only ones who came to Earth. They brought with them another race called the Igigi, who were essentially a lower caste. To the Anunnaki, they served only as slaves, and this lower race was the main source of labor for the Anunnaki, working in the mining stations to dig for gold after centuries of hard labor. The race called the Igigi rebelled, thinking they could easily overpower their masters. However, because of their numbers, the Anunnaki were in the minority. The Igigi made a mistake, and the rebellion was brutally crushed by the Anunnaki. Almost all of them were killed, nearly wiped out. This left the Anunnaki without a labor force, but gold production could not be slowed down due to the needs of their home planet, Nibiru. The Anunnaki found themselves in trouble. There were too few of them to handle all the mining work on Earth, even with their advanced technology. Since they had no replacement for the Igigi, the ruler of Nibiru ordered his son Enki to genetically create a new race of workers. This species had to be intelligent enough to perform complex tasks independently, but not so advanced as to pose a threat to the Anunnaki themselves. Always ready for a challenge, as described in the text called Atrahasis, many beings and creatures were created through experiments. Unfortunately for the Anunnaki, these experiments were unsuccessful. They simply couldn't create a satisfactory being until Enki finally decided to create a genetic hybrid. Between the Anunnaki themselves and Homo erectus, this hybrid, let's call it Homo sapiens, was referred to in Sumerian records as Adamu, the first man. You might find it interesting that 1,000 years later, In biblical Hebrew texts, Adam, of course, means man. Some of these Homo sapiens were put to work in the mines, while others had different jobs in the area of present-day Mesopotamia. Early humans had no choice. They had to work and worship their creators. The creators, who were also called giants, were much larger than people today. Since they created humans with some of their own DNA, humans looked very similar to them. This brings us to a later well-known phrase from another book written 1,000 years later: "Let us make man in our image." Why the plural in the Bible? Let us make man in our image. Very interesting. The main task of Homo sapiens was to serve the Anunnaki. Therefore, some of them taught humans their skills, social relations, and academic knowledge, but they also taught people how to handle their technologies. The problem with humans was that they were sterile. Genetically modified Homo sapiens were not intended to reproduce. But as the work expanded, so did the demand for labor. So, through genetic engineering, the Anunnaki enabled humans to reproduce. After thousands of years, this act led to the overpopulation of cities under Anunnaki rule. And so they decided to expel a large number of people from their cities. All of this happened about 200,000 years ago, which led to the spread of Homo sapiens to other continents. And people were causing overpopulation for another very interesting reason. Since they were genetically modified, they shared more genetic material with the Anunnaki themselves, who lived for hundreds of thousands of years. These people live much longer than people do today. I'm talking about lifespans of thousands and hundreds of years, and here I'll refer again to the Bible, which describes such people, like Methuselah, who lived 969 years and later became a synonym for longevity. This was a big problem, considering that the population kept growing while only a few died. Once again, through intervention, they genetically altered the code so that humans would live shorter lives, and with thousands of years of intermixing, the Anunnaki genes gradually disappeared, and today we've ended up with an average lifespan of 70 to 80 years. As time went on, people became more intelligent, and certain groups became even more intelligent, which started to attract human women with whom they decided to reproduce. This led to offspring who were giants, just like the Anunnaki themselves. Here, you might also know them by the name Nephilim. This act and event completely enraged Enlil, the then ruler of the Anunnaki, who was the brother of Enki, the main creator of Homo sapiens. Enlil decided to make sure that no human would ever have the chance to become a potential ruler of Nibiru. Sexual mixing between the Anunnaki and humans, which produced the Nephilim, only increased that risk. But it was beyond his control. Humans were spreading across the planet unstoppably. It's important to emphasize that from the very beginning, the idea behind creating the Homo sapiens hybrid was just like that. There was a conflict. One side didn't even want to hear about such an abomination, because in their view, only the Almighty Father could create living beings. This is interesting, because even though humans considered the Anunnaki to be gods, they actually weren't. In fact, even the Anunnaki themselves believed the opposite. They believed in the force of the universe. The other group, led by Enki, wanted to create humans. They wanted to do it despite the opposition, and according to ancient Sumerian texts, this even led to ancient wars among themselves. A great cataclysm occurred, caused by Nibiru itself as it entered the inner parts of our solar system. As the planet approached the sun, black spots appeared, the magnetic poles began to weaken, and the temperature on the planet started to rise, causing the polar ice caps to melt. This event is perhaps known as the Great Flood or the Biblical Deluge. In the days before the Great Flood, the earth vibrated, earthquakes began to occur all over the world, and a bright star appeared in the night sky. That was Nibiru. The Anunnaki, of course, foresaw the catastrophe, and their ruler Enlil saw this as a perfect opportunity to get rid of humans. Enlil returned to Nibiru, but many other Anunnaki decided to stay on Earth, orbiting the planet in their heavenly cities. The earthquakes grew stronger and stronger, and day turned into night with black storm clouds raging across the entire planet. The ice sheets of the South Pole broke off and collapsed into the ocean, creating a cataclysmic global tsunami that struck every continent, including one of the first Anunnaki cities, which according to this theory is now somewhere at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Knowing what kind of cataclysm was approaching, Enki, who created humans and felt pity and sympathy for his creation, decided to take action and warn certain groups of people about the coming disaster. However, the few people who were warned were limited to his own family. This is the story in the Bible, later known as Noah, who built a huge wooden ark in order to save as many people and animals as possible from the impending catastrophe. The tidal waves were all ready. The unrelenting rains flooded the land for 7 days before the situation finally began to calm down a bit, but the rains continued to fall for a full 40 days after that. The story of the Great Flood is recorded in almost every ancient civilization, and from today's perspective and with modern research, we more or less know when that flood actually happened. It was an event that took place about 10,000 years ago. After the cataclysm and the Great Flood, the Anunnaki began constructing new buildings. Mining stations, spaceports, and perhaps some of you might be interested in the pyramids as well. Along with many other ancient archaeological sites, soon after that, for reasons unknown, most of the Anunnaki left the planet Earth, leaving behind their representatives who ruled among humans. The races had already mixed, and over time, the Anunnaki began to be replaced by human rulers. Here, we already arrive at the period after the Sumerian civilization, where the Egyptian civilization emerges, along with many other civilizations, including those in Central and South America. As time passed after the flood, events turned into stories, myths, and legends. Technologies were lost, and gradually, the classical civilizations you know today began to emerge. It's quite possible that true stories and facts, like the destruction of Atlantis, turned into fiction. Entire civilizations forgot their origins, and religions arose, partially adopting stories and events from ancient times. Why did the Anunnaki leave, and will they ever return? That is the question of all questions. From your perspective, thousands of years have passed. While from their perspective, as beings who live for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe only one unremarkable and boring year has passed, a year in which they observe our development. Will Nibiru return so soon? Changes in our solar system and planet have already started happening. Is Planet 9 the cause of this? We simply don't know, and right now, nothing suggests that anything is moving toward the inner part of the solar system, toward Earth, and we hope it stays that way. Everything you've heard today is not taken seriously by modern science. The mainstream scientific community considers all these stories to be mere myths and legends. Certain groups of people disagree with the main scientific theories and believe that the ancient Sumerian records are a more accurate account of historical events. The problem is that only a few hundred people can accurately translate cuneiform, that is, the Sumerian language, and today's interpretations come from one of the first theorists of extraterrestrial origin, namely Zecharia Sitchin. The Sumerian language is extremely difficult to interpret. It takes years to understand the meaning that emerges from these texts, and although most scholars translate the texts accurately, there is a big difference in interpretation, that is, in how these texts are understood, and that is entirely up to you. Will you consider this to be just myths, or will you believe that these are historical records of events that actually happened? A civilization that appeared literally out of nowhere and immediately invented writing, do you think one of their first works would be to write science fiction? I don't think so. These ancient Sumerian records hide something more than mere fiction, just like all the other archaeological mysteries and stories that are connected to new Sumerian writings. I think I can safely say that we are truly a civilization with amnesia, a civilization that has forgotten its history and roots. Is someone hiding the real historical facts from us? Well, that's a topic for another video. One thing is certain, tell me honestly, how many people could actually handle such a truth if it were presented to all of humanity? I'm not talking here about you who believe this is true, or you who have an open mind and remain skeptical. Really think about how the majority of people on this planet would react if someone told them, your religion is made up, that you've completely misunderstood what this is all about, your God was actually an extraterrestrial scientist who created you. Figuratively speaking, from a test tube, your God isn't even a God at all. I think you know the answer to this question very well. This is just one of the many answers to the eternal question, why do they hide the truth from you? If this is indeed the truth, and be honest, you would hide it too if you knew what consequences could arise. Also keep in mind that with this video, I've only scratched the surface of the topic. Those kinds of records don't bring back the one who fought and why, nor do they describe the details from the Garden of Eden and why Adam and Eve were banished, talks about who the serpent in the Garden of Eden was, who the devil really is. The answer will surprise many of you, and tell me, why did this story partially inspire one of the greatest directors of our time, Ridley Scott, to make 2 films about this ancient race, which in the movie he calls the Engineers, even though these characters are entirely based on the story of the ancient Sumerians? Are they the ones who said, "Let us make man in our image"? What if all of this is true? How many of you could handle such a truth? Who are the fallen angels? Who are the unknown beings that ancient people mention in their earliest myths and legends, and how much are those myths and legends based on real events? Who are the Anunnaki? What was the Garden of Eden? What is the mark of the beast? And, in the end, who is Lucifer? In this alternative version of forbidden history, according to Zacharias Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, and many other authors who, with their different interpretations of ancient Sumerian script, have brought new ideas about the origins of human civilization itself, we have partially answered this question in the previous video titled Forbidden Knowledge. The greatest secret in the history of humanity, and to better understand what you'll hear today, I suggest that if you haven't already, you watch that video first, because today we're continuing with some very interesting and new information. What's interesting is that ancient people considered the Anunnaki to be gods who created human civilization. But the Anunnaki themselves were not gods. The ancient people may have simply mistaken the incomprehensible and magical technology for divine powers. And the Anunnaki themselves believed in a forefather and an almighty creator of the entire universe. In other words, it seems that they too believed in a supreme God. This brings us to a very interesting situation. Whoever or whatever created this reality and the universe we live in set certain rules. And this reality of yours is strictly defined by the laws of physics, but also by chemistry, and the laws are exactly as they are and as they must be. The creator of this universe has to abide by their own laws. Which means you can't just magically snap your fingers and create life, in this case, a human, from a piece of earth, and then create a woman from that man's rib. That's a metaphor from the Bible, a metaphor that might still hide something fantastic, but it's still just a metaphor. If you want to create life, you have to follow the exact rules set in this universe, and that applies even to the creator or creators themselves. You will create life from building blocks that are best suited for forming a living being, from the simplest bacteria all the way to a complex creature like a human. For that task, you will use what is adaptable and what is abundant. Let me give you a very simple example here. You decide to build a weekend cabin in the middle of the woods. What will you use to build your cabin or cottage? Since there is an obvious choice of materials around you, you will most likely use wood. If you want to build a house in a remote place without such a selection of materials, you are forced to make a different version of the house. In this case, you use stone, you work with what you have. Now, let's make the situation a bit more complicated. Do you want to create life? You need a stable, so to speak, building material to create living beings. All living beings, including humans, are made up of chemical elements. You, all of you, are literally made up of elements that were formed in ancient nuclear physical reactions called alpha processes, in which helium is transformed into heavier elements. Of particular interest is the triple alpha process, where helium, through nuclear fusion in stars, is turned into carbon. In a process called a supernova, certain stars, in a massive cosmic explosion, scatter a new type of chemical elements into the universe, elements that can potentially create life. The most important element among them is called carbon, especially its most common form known as carbon-12. Carbon-12 is the foundation of life and the most important chemical element that makes life possible. It is the main component of proteins, sugars, fats, and your DNA. Your entire body, including mine, is made of carbon-12, so think of it as the basis of life. The most important chemical element without which life as you know it wouldn't exist, and now something really interesting. Carbon-12 consists of 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. This is a very interesting number that I believe you've all heard of. The meaning of this number has been tried to be deciphered for years by many researchers and numerologists. There are several theories, but no one is completely sure what the number represents. Although this is just one coincidence, since carbon-12 has 6 protons, neutrons, and electrons, the building blocks of life, then that's a very interesting coincidence. Especially because the Bible, in the case of the number 666, is quite clear. The book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 18, says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and its number is 666. You really have to ask yourself why they are called beasts in the Bible. Carbon-12, the mysterious number 6606, the mark of the beast, that is man. Information distorted over 1,000 years through myths and legends may not be connected to each other, but maybe they speak of an ancient myth of the ancient Sumerians, recorded long before any other religious or historical books, which brings us back to the Anunnaki. The following information you are about to hear presents an alternative version of our history and consists of theories from many researchers and scientists who have tried to interpret ancient texts through modern eyes. This means, for example, that Zechariah Sitchin did not mistranslate the ancient Sumerian script, rather, that script does not explicitly mention genetic engineering. Instead, he arrived at his conclusions through his own interpretation of certain events, which he, along with some others, considered to be historical events. And the main characters in today's story are Enlil and Ninmah, also known as Ninhursag, the supreme commander of all the gods, Enlil, the lord of the sky and air, Enki, the lord of the earth and water, and the mountain goddess Ninhursag or Ninmah, who is Enki's wife. Of course, there are many other gods involved, but for the myth of the creation of man, these 4 figures are the most important. Enlil was the supreme commander on earth who approved the creation of a new being, that is, Homo sapiens. Although this might seem like a good thing, in today's story, Enlil is actually the main villain, a tyrant who considered humans to be nothing more than ordinary beasts and animals, and who ultimately wanted to destroy them, fearing what these humans might become. On the other hand, we have Enki. Enki is the hero, the creator and protector of the human race, who, with the help of the chief scientist, his wife Ninmah, genetically created humans by combining the genes of the Anunnaki themselves with the genes of the humanoids they found on Earth at that time. These humanoids were Homo erectus. After establishing their initial base, called Eridu, in the area of today's Persian Gulf, they began to expand their influence to the surrounding regions, entering Central Africa and the place called Zahra Sitchino, where the first human being was created for the first time. That is the place where the biblical Garden of Eden is located. Because if you remember from the first part of the story, there was a slave species called the Igigi. The Igigi, who were a slave species, rebelled, and the Anunnaki almost wiped them out, which left them without a workforce. After that, They came up with the idea to create a new being that would serve them as slaves, among other things, for mining gold. At that time, beings like those found on our planet were in the minority, and there were never more than a few hundred of them on the planet. They simply needed a massive and large workforce. And Enlil had nothing against the idea of creating a rough, cheap labor force, and some researchers believe that Neanderthals were that first workforce, intelligent enough and physically robust for complex tasks, serving their purpose. This is a really interesting topic for a separate video, because at that time, according to archaeological discoveries, there were several different intelligent humanoid species on our planet, like the Denisovans, for example, who went extinct in Siberia, and various types of humanoids who lived in isolated areas all over our planet and were not in contact with each other. They mysteriously appeared to each other and mysteriously disappeared, which has led to theories that they too were early genetic experiments in Enki's desire to create an even more advanced being, that is, Homo sapiens. And this being was created with the help of his wife, the goddess Ninmah, by taking male reproductive cells from the Anunnaki and female reproductive cells from Homo erectus, which were then artificially fertilized. The embryo would then be implanted into Anunnaki women, who would give birth to these beings, that is, the first Homo sapiens, by name Adama. Homo sapiens, or in Latin, wise man, who first appeared in what is now southern Ethiopia. Of course, Sumerian tablets do not mention genetic engineering, because people at that time didn't even know what that was. The creation myth is partially similar to the one in the Bible, and in the Sumerian texts it literally says, Enki, the creator of human civilization, made man by mixing clay and the blood of the slain god Kingu. According to Zechariah Sitchin and other ancient alien theorists, this base in the area of southern Ethiopia was an isolated area where they kept these first humans, a closed-off region, like some kind of biosphere with gardens where fruit and vegetables were grown. For this reason, through myths and legends, it came to be known as the Garden of Eden. Was the biblical Garden of Eden the place where the first humans lived, who, in terms of intelligence and appearance, were much closer to the Anunnaki of that time? And even then, there still weren't so many problems between Enlil, the main commander on Earth, and Enki, his half-brother and the creator of humans. In that so-called Garden of Eden, it wasn't just two people as the story goes, but rather a group of several people who, in a way, studied and learned. Enki and his wife didn't want the masses, but they did want something more from their creation, so they gave these people clothing and began teaching them knowledge that was reserved only for the Anunnaki, clearly separating them from ordinary beasts and animals. When Enlil found out about this act, he went mad, considering it blasphemy to elevate ordinary animals. Enlil tried to create beings that would be superior in abilities. This was the last straw, and it led to conflict and wars between these two half-brothers, resulting in the expulsion of humans from this so-called Garden of Eden. Since history is written by the victors, and Enlil was the supreme commander on Earth and a god in Sumerian myths, he and his wife Ninhursag were, of course, later portrayed as the villains, depicted as Lucifer. This is Satan, who, in the form of a serpent, tempted Eve by offering her the forbidden fruit. That fruit is simply knowledge, and by accepting it, she directly disobeyed the command of the Supreme Commander, Enlil. Which means that Enki, the protector of humanity himself, was later declared to be Lucifer, who led a rebellion against God himself, and was eventually, along with his followers and army, banished to Earth. That army and those allies of Enki were later called the fallen angels, as described in the Book of Enoch. Enoch is a particularly interesting figure in order, just a man who, according to records, lived for 365 years and who walked with God himself, and was later taken to the heavenly kingdom where he learned ancient knowledge. His writings, that is, the Book of Enoch, were mysteriously removed from the Bible in the 4th century. So, even though his texts were used in early Christianity, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Christian religious leaders decided to completely remove the Book of Enoch from religious doctrine. He wrote about some very interesting things that might shed new light on ancient Sumerian myths, but we'll maybe talk about that another time. Because when you research topics like these, they can take you to some truly fascinating places you might never have even thought of before. For example, Have you ever wondered what this symbol represents? So, is the staff of Hermes a symbol of medicine and the symbol of the ancient Greek god Hermes, son of Zeus, who in Greek mythology was the god of merchants, travelers, and athletes? What does that god have to do with modern medicine? And what if I told you that Hermes is actually the Egyptian god Thoth, or the god of wisdom? What if I told you that Thoth is actually the Sumerian god Ninjishida, to whom this symbol, representing two intertwined snakes, is attributed? The god of the underworld, when you translate his name directly, you get Lord of the Divine Tree, considering that he appears at the same time as the story of the creation of humans. And although it's interesting that this ancient symbol, which today represents medicine, strongly resembles a double helix spiral, that's actually just a DNA symbol, the very symbol of life itself. And now, something even more interesting. All the gods of the Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians are actually the same gods, just with new civilizations changing their names. The origins of these gods go all the way back to the very beginning. Records, training, and the Sumerian era, events from what is now the myth of creation, might date back as far as 200,000 years ago, in the area of present-day Ethiopia, which is also where the best examples of some of the earliest Homo sapiens, that is, modern humans, have been found. These remains are known as Omo. And it's really interesting that it was precisely in this region of southern Ethiopia where the first Homo sapiens appeared, marking the beginning of their expansion toward the Asian and European continents. For millions of years, various types of humanoids walked the earth, none particularly intelligent or advanced. Then, almost overnight, Homo sapiens appeared with their superior intelligence compared to other beings that roamed the earth. Was this a sudden evolutionary leap, or was it something entirely different? The theory of evolution is one of the most well-proven theories that exists. The evidence is all around you and the theory is undeniable. But there are major gaps when it comes to explaining how Homo sapiens could have appeared so suddenly, while all the other humanoids simply vanished. The theory of evolution perfectly explains the animal world, but certain archaeological evidence is simply missing, making it hard to explain the sudden emergence of modern humans. That's when you start having problems with the theory of evolution. And actually, the real problem is with human evolution, because I've often heard people comment that the theory of evolution is just nonsense. That's completely untrue. The theory of evolution works perfectly in every aspect, except for the detailed explanation of our own origins. And if anyone tells you that evolution doesn't exist, just show them any dog. Many of you watching probably have dogs as pets. Do you think evolution, or rather, nature, created such a creature? No, all the dogs you see were created by humans. If dogs could talk, they would consider all humans to be their gods, their creators, because that's exactly what we are to them. We are the ones who created their evolution artificially, by crossbreeding all sorts of breeds, so that after 1,000 years, we went from this to this. Natural evolution, that is, natural selection and variation, would never have produced so many different shapes and types of dogs, just as nature might never have created so many variations of humanoids, after which only one would remain on a new planet. Did they really create humans through genetic engineering, or is that just an ordinary myth? Who knows? But don't forget, all myths have their origins in real events. 1,000 years of oral tradition, copying, and spreading stories leads to the distortion of information, like the story of man being created from clay. But sometimes, myths turn out to be true. Ancient Troy, for example, was considered just a myth for a very, very long time until it was discovered. So we really have to ask ourselves. Some people think that I personally believe in these kinds of myths and legends. Above all, I am an objective researcher, offering you alternative information that some of you might not have been familiar with. After you gather all possible information, it's only logical to try to draw your own conclusions about where the truth is more likely to be hidden. If it turned out that humans were really created through genetic engineering, I'd say, okay, let's move on and investigate other mysteries. And if it turned out that it was all just a made-up myth and legend, I'd say the same thing, okay. Let's move on. I wouldn't be thrilled if it turned out they were created that way, nor would I be disappointed if it turned out this was all just legend. I remain neutral. I observe and research the beliefs that exist, and I set my own aside. But I'm pretty convinced that there's really something more hidden in these ancient Sumerian records, which are among the first on our planet. Some things explained by modern archaeology just don't add up, and there are still big gaps and mysteries. We really have to ask ourselves, what if all of this is true? That would mean we've solved one of the greatest mysteries and discovered aliens. If you want to see what those aliens look like, all you have to do is look in the mirror. There you go. See you soon. Best regards. Bye.